My name is Rose. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe with quiet, comfortable words. Steady, reliable, low maintenance. I work, I show up, I listen more than I speak. I'm the woman people trust with their kids, their secrets, their unfinished sentences. What people don't usually see is that calm doesn't mean passive, and silence doesn't mean absence of thought. It just means I learned early how to observe before I react. If you met me before everything changed, you probably would have underestimated me. Most people did. I was the spouse who didn't make scenes, the partner who handled logistics while others handled attention. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, and I wasn't trying to be. I believed that consistency was a kind of love, that loyalty didn't need to announce itself. This story isn't about rage. It isn't about revenge, humiliation, or public exposure. I'm not here to villainize anyone, and I'm not asking for sympathy. What I want is honesty. Clean, uncomfortable honesty. About what happens when you slowly realize the life you thought you were in was never the same life your spouse was living. I found out my spouse never intended to stay faithful. Sounds dramatic. No screaming, no shattered objects, no cinematic confrontation. What there was instead was a gradual understanding that settled into my body like cold weather. Monogamy was never part of the agreement, only I didn't know. This is a story about noticing, about the small dismissals that don't look like abuse, the jokes that land a little too sharply, the way certain questions are never answered directly. It's about how easily loyalty can be mistaken for invisibility, and how often silence is interpreted as consent. Over the next chapters, I'll walk you through who I was in that marriage, how others saw me, and how I learned, quietly, methodically, that I was playing a role I never agreed to audition for. You'll hear about the moment something shifted inside me, not outwardly, but internally, about how silence, once a habit, became a choice, and how clarity, once it arrives, doesn't shout. It simply refuses to leave. There are no heroes or monsters here. Just people operating on different moral contracts, some spoken, some assumed, some deliberately withheld. I'm telling this story not to punish the past, but to understand it, and to leave a record for anyone who has ever felt that something was wrong, but couldn't yet prove it. So before we begin, let me ask you something gently, without accusation or expectation. Have you ever sensed that you were being loyal to a version of the truth that only you believed in? To them, I was easy. That was the word that came up most often, usually said with a smile, as if it were a compliment. Rose is easy to live with, easy to agree with, easy to rely on, easy not to argue with. I carried that label without resistance for years, not realizing how much space it quietly erased. In my marriage, I was the stable one, the planner, the person who remembered birthdays, handled insurance renewals, and noticed when the fridge needed restocking. I kept our life running smoothly enough that it felt effortless to everyone except me. Not because it was hard, but because it was invisible. At dinners with friends, I was the listener. While conversations curved toward louder personalities, I stayed slightly outside the spotlight, refilling glasses, asking follow-up questions, smoothing transitions. People liked me. They trusted me. They rarely asked me what I wanted. My spouse used to introduce me by saying, "She's the responsible one," or "She keeps everything together." It sounded affectionate. I accepted it as love expressed through admiration. What I didn't hear, because I wasn't listening for it yet, was the absence of desire in those descriptions. I was competent, I was reliable, I was infrastructure. And infrastructure, by definition, isn't meant to be seen. When decisions were made, my input was assumed rather than requested. If I disagreed quietly, it was treated as stress, not preference. If I didn't object, it was taken as endorsement. Over time, my silence became a kind of permission slip others filled out on my behalf. I wasn't unhappy. That's important to say. I didn't wake up every morning feeling wronged or neglected. I believed we had a mature relationship, one without drama, without jealousy, without the exhausting emotional volatility I saw in other couples. I mistook calm for equity. To outsiders, we look at balanced. I was the grounding presence, the one who didn't need much. That phrase followed me everywhere. Rose doesn't need much, as if needs were flaws you outgrew rather than signals you listened to. In group settings, I was often spoken over, not aggressively, just casually. My sentences sometimes went unfinished because someone else jumped in. When that happened, I didn't push back. I let it go. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that being flexible was a strength. What I didn't realize was that flexibility, when unreciprocated, slowly turns into erasure. My spouse saw me as loyal, unquestioning, safe. Someone who wouldn't complicate things with emotional demands or inconvenient boundaries. I was trusted precisely because I didn't require negotiation. And that trust was built on an assumption I never explicitly agreed to, that I would continue absorbing whatever didn't fit neatly into their version of the relationship. I filled in the gaps without complaint, emotional gaps, logistical gaps, moral gray areas that I sensed but didn't yet have language for. I thought love meant patience. I thought understanding meant accommodation. And because I didn't protest, no one thought to ask whether I consented. Looking back, what strikes me most is not how poorly I was treated, but how consistently I was misread. My quiet was interpreted as contentment. My lack of confrontation was mistaken for alignment. My trust was confused with ignorance. I was present, but I was not fully seen. And I participated in that invisibility because I believed being low friction made me valuable. This is who I was to them: dependable, quiet, non-threatening, a woman whose loyalty was assumed rather than honored, a partner whose boundaries were never tested because no one thought they existed. At the time, I didn't yet understand that being underestimated isn't always accidental. Sometimes, it's convenient. The first moment that stayed with me didn't announce itself as betrayal. It didn't even register as a conflict. At the time, it felt more like a paper cut, minor, almost invisible, but strangely sharp when touched. We were at a small gathering, nothing formal. A few colleagues, a couple of friends, wine on the table, low music in the background. The kind of evening where conversation drifts and people talk a little more freely than they might intend to. I remember leaning against the kitchen counter, listening, mostly. That was my position in rooms back then. Close enough to be involved, far enough not to interrupt the flow. Someone asked my spouse how we made our relationship work so well. It was meant as a compliment. I watched them smile, tilt their head slightly and say, "We don't believe in ownership. We give each other space." It wasn't untrue, or at least it wasn't obviously false. I nodded along because space sounded healthy, mature. But then they added almost casually, "Neither of us is the jealous type." The sentence hung there longer than it should have. I wasn't jealous. That part was true. But I had never said that fidelity didn't matter to me. I had never said exclusivity was optional. I had certainly never agreed that space meant reinterpretation of commitment. Someone laughed approvingly. Another person said something about how refreshing that was. The conversation moved on. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not pain exactly, more like alertness. A quiet internal note. That's not how I would have said it. Later, when we were alone, I mentioned it. Not confrontationally. Just a comment, delivered in the same calm tone I use for everything. "You made it sound like we don't have boundaries," I said. They looked surprised, genuinely, then amused. "I didn't say that." "You implied it. I think you're reading too much into it," they replied, already turning away, as if the matter had been resolved by definition. That was the cut, not the statement itself, but the dismissal. The way my discomfort was framed was as over-interpretation rather than something worth examining. The way the conversation ended without actually ending, no agreement reached, no clarification offered. I told myself it wasn't important, that I was being sensitive, that public conversations weren't the place to parse private nuance. I had years of practice minimizing my own reactions. It came naturally, but something had shifted, a small recalibration. After that night, I started noticing patterns I'd previously skimmed past. How certain jokes landed differently when I was the one hearing them. How references to freedom and independence were always framed as shared values, even when I hadn't expressed them in those terms. There were comments made in front of others that positioned me as unusually tolerant. "Rose doesn't mind," my spouse would say, about things I had never been asked about late nights, about emotional closeness with people I barely knew, about blurred edges that were apparently obvious to everyone except me. When I followed up privately, the response was always the same: confusion, mild irritation, reassurance without specificity. You know I love you. You're the only one who matters. You're imagining threats that aren't there. Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a wall, not a loud one, a soft one, padded with affection and plausible deniability. Friends didn't notice. Or if they did, they interpreted it as progressive, evolved. I could see admiration in their reactions. I could also see how easily my silence reinforced the narrative being built around me. I didn't argue. I stored the moment away instead, like a document filed under unresolved. I didn't yet know why it mattered, only that it did. That's the thing about the first cut. It doesn't bleed much. You keep moving. You don't stop the evening. You don't rewrite your understanding of someone you trust because of one sentence. But your body remembers. And once it does, it starts watching more carefully. After the first cut, nothing dramatic happened. That was almost the problem. Life continued in the same rhythms. Work, dinners, shared jokes, shared space. On the surface, we were unchanged. But underneath, something subtle began to reorganize itself. I started noticing how often my discomfort was treated as an inconvenience, rather than information. It showed up in small, repeatable ways. Comments that made me pause, followed by explanations that smoothed them over before I could fully examine what bothered me. Boundaries that were never crossed outright, only leaned against, just enough to see if they would hold. When I asked questions, I was met with reassurance instead of answers. "You're overthinking" became a familiar phrase, not said sharply, said gently, kindly, even, as if concern itself were the issue, not the behavior that provoked it. I told myself this was what emotional maturity looked like, choosing peace over conflict, trusting instead of interrogating. I had absorbed the cultural script that jealousy was insecurity, that asking for clarity was controlling, that strong relationships didn't need rules spelled out. So I stayed quiet. I learned how to swallow unease and call it flexibility. There were moments when I sensed I was being positioned as unusually understanding. Friends would say things like, "You're so chill about everything," or "I could never be as relaxed as you." I smiled because that's what you do when praised. But the praise felt strangely hollow, like it was rewarding me for not asking to be considered. My spouse leaned into that version of me, the low-drama partner, the one who didn't ask follow-up questions, the one who trusted without verification. And every time I let something slide, it reinforced an expectation, not just for them, but for everyone watching. What I didn't realize yet was that I was being slowly trained, not deliberately, not with malice, but through repetition, through the consistent framing of my feelings as excessive and my silence as evidence of agreement. Over time, the cost of speaking up began to feel higher than the cost of staying quiet. I remember one evening in particular. We were sitting across from each other, phones on the table, half watching something neither of us was really engaged in. I mentioned, carefully, that I felt slightly disconnected lately. Not accusing, just naming a feeling. They sighed, not heavily, just enough. "Nothing has changed," they said. "You're imagining distance because you're stressed." It was such a clean dismissal that I almost admired it. Efficient, final. There was no opening for discussion because the premise itself was rejected. If the feeling was imaginary, there was nothing to address. So I apologized. That's the part that stays with me now. Not what they said, but how quickly I took responsibility for sensing something off. How easily I accepted the explanation that my intuition was faulty. After that, I began editing myself preemptively. I filtered which thoughts were worth voicing. I delayed conversations until the discomfort passed, then told myself it hadn't been real to begin with. I became skilled at minimizing. From the outside, this looked like harmony. Inside, it felt like compression, like folding myself smaller to maintain equilibrium. Still, I didn't see it as disrespect. Not yet. That word felt too strong. Disrespect belonged to obvious cruelty, raised voices, and contempt. This was none of those things. This was subtle, polite, wrapped in affection. That's how it normalized. Because when something doesn't hurt enough to demand immediate action, you learn to live with it. You adjust. You reinterpret. You assume good intent and tell yourself that love means giving the benefit of the doubt. What I didn't understand then was that normalization doesn't require agreement. It only requires repetition. And with every repeated dismissal, something inside me grew quieter, not weaker, but more observant. I was collecting data, even as I told myself I was being patient. I didn't know yet what I was preparing for. I just knew that I was no longer confused. I was unsettled, and that feeling, unlike the others, refused to be explained away. It took time for me to understand that what was happening wasn't a series of misunderstandings. It was a role assignment. I didn't receive it in writing. There was no explicit conversation where expectations were laid out. It emerged gradually, through repetition and response, through what was rewarded and what was quietly discouraged. My role was the stable one, the reasonable one, the partner who could be counted on not to complicate things. I was expected to absorb ambiguity without protest, to interpret inconsistency generously, to prioritize peace over precision. And because I had done those things in the past, it was assumed I would continue doing them indefinitely. In this role, I wasn't meant to ask too many questions. Curiosity could be tolerated, but only briefly, and only if it resolved itself quickly. Prolonged discomfort was framed as insecurity. Clarifying conversations were treated as unnecessary. I began to see how predictably my behavior was being anticipated. If something questionable happened, I would be informed just enough to prevent suspicion, but not enough to invite discussion. If I reacted neutrally, the matter was closed. If I hesitated, reassurance would be offered until I softened. I was reliable in my reactions. That reliability became a form of control. The version of me that existed in my spouse's mind was calm, forgiving, and undemanding. That version was useful. It allowed for flexibility without accountability. It allowed lines to blur without ever being officially crossed, and I participated in maintaining it. I told myself that trust meant not needing explanations, that love meant assuming the best, that my discomfort was something to manage internally rather than address externally. But there were moments, quiet ones, when I noticed how asymmetrical things had become, how much emotional labor flowed in one direction, how often I adjusted while the structure itself remained unchanged. When friends praised our relationship, I felt a strange detachment. They admired the absence of conflict. They didn't see the absence of negotiation. The role I played didn't require me to be deeply known. It required me to be consistent. What struck me later was how little effort was made to understand my inner world, not because it was inaccessible, but because it wasn't necessary for the arrangement to function. As long as I continued performing stability, the system held. I don't believe my spouse set out to reduce me. I think they simply grew comfortable inside a dynamic that asked very little of them emotionally, a dynamic where my silence filled in all the gaps. And because I didn't disrupt it, it solidified. I remember thinking, at one point, that if I ever truly objected, if I drew a clear line, it would feel like betrayal to them. Not because the line was unreasonable, but because it deviated from the role they'd come to rely on. That realization was sobering. It meant that my compliance had become part of the contract, an unspoken expectation that I would continue being flexible, continue being understanding, and continue being quiet. But contracts that aren't mutually reviewed aren't agreements. They're assumptions. And once I saw the role clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I understood that as long as I continued playing it, nothing would change. Not because change was impossible, but because there was no incentive for it. This wasn't about love fading. It was about convenience settling in. I was useful in my predictability. I was valued for what I didn't demand. And that realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because once you know the role you've been assigned, you also know exactly what will happen if you stop performing it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no discovery, no confrontation. It happened on a day so ordinary, I wouldn't have remembered it at all if not for what changed inside me. It was a weekday morning, gray, quiet. I was standing in the kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil. My spouse was on the phone in the other room, speaking in that low, careful tone people use when they don't want to be overheard. but not urgently enough to leave the house. I wasn't listening, not consciously. I was thinking about my schedule, the meeting I had later, and the errands I needed to run. Then I heard my name. Not spoken directly, referenced. "She's fine with it," they said. The sentence was delivered casually and confidently. No hesitation, no check-in. I stood still. The kettle clicked off behind me. I didn't move to pour the water. Fine with what? I waited, not to eavesdrop, but because something in me wanted to see what would happen next. Whether there would be clarification. There wasn't. The conversation drifted on, tone relaxed, unguarded. That was the moment, not because of what I heard, but because of how little doubt there was in their voice. The certainty, the assumption that my consent was automatic, implied, and permanent. I realized then that my silence had been interpreted as standing permission. When the call ended, my spouse came into the kitchen, kissed my cheek, and asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. My voice sounded normal, steady, the same voice I'd always used. But internally, something recalibrated. For the first time, I didn't rush to resolve the discomfort. I didn't tell myself there was a reasonable explanation waiting. I didn't plan how to bring it up gently later. I just observed. Over the next few days, I noticed how often decisions were narrated to others with me already included. My preferences summarized, my boundaries predefined. How often my imagined agreements smoothed social interactions before I even entered the room. And I understood something that had eluded me before. This wasn't miscommunication. It was a system. One that functioned because my consent was assumed rather than confirmed. That realization didn't make me emotional. It made me calm. There was relief in finally having the right frame. The unease I'd been carrying had a shape now. It wasn't insecurity or overthinking, it was misalignment. I didn't confront them that day, or the next, or the week after. Instead, I began asking myself quiet questions. What exactly do I believe I've agreed to? What do I know for certain? And what have I simply allowed to be inferred? If I were hearing this story from someone else, what would I notice? I started replaying conversations with new clarity, not to punish the past, but to understand the pattern. Each time I'd been reassured instead of answered. Each time my concern had been reframed as stress or sensitivity. I wasn't angry at myself. I was curious. How had I participated in this without realizing it? The answer was uncomfortable but honest. I had valued being low friction more than being fully informed. I had mistaken trust for silence. I had believed that love didn't require explicit boundaries. That belief shifted that morning, not into suspicion, into discernment. I understood that clarity is not the enemy of intimacy, that consent cannot exist without information, and that loyalty, when it's assumed rather than chosen, becomes a liability. From that day on, I stopped reacting automatically. I listened more closely. I spoke less, not out of fear, but out of intention. The shift wasn't visible yet. To anyone else, I was the same Rose. Calm, cooperative, reliable. But inside, I had stepped out of the role without announcing it. And once you do that, you don't rush. You watch. You learn. You let the truth reveal itself without interference. That was the day silence stopped being a habit. It became a choice. After the shift, my silence felt different. Before, it had been reflexive, something I defaulted to in order to keep things smooth. Now, it was deliberate. I spoke when it mattered. I withheld when observation would tell me more than confrontation ever could. This wasn't a strategy I planned in advance. It emerged naturally once I stopped needing immediate reassurance. When you no longer depend on someone else to resolve your discomfort, you gain a certain kind of freedom. You can afford to wait. I began to notice how quickly people reveal themselves when they believe nothing has changed. My spouse continued as before, confident in the dynamic. They narrated plans, made assumptions, and referenced conversations we had never actually had. And I responded neutrally, not affirming, not objecting, just present. That neutrality was interpreted as agreement. What surprised me was how little effort was made to check in. There were no clarifying questions, no pauses. My silence still functioned as consent because it always had. I started keeping my thoughts to myself, not out of secrecy, but out of discernment. I wanted to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I decided how to respond. At night, when I lay awake, I replayed interactions without emotional distortion. I wasn't looking for evidence to justify leaving or staying. I was mapping reality. And reality, once you stop editing it, has a way of becoming very clear. I noticed patterns in timing, in whom was spoken about and how, in what information was volunteered versus what required prompting. I noticed how certain topics were redirected smoothly, how humor was used to soften deflection, and I noticed how often my role was reinforced externally. Friends praised my understanding. My spouse referenced my open-mindedness as a shared value. I was being publicly positioned in a narrative I had never fully agreed to. Still, I said nothing, not because I felt powerless, but because I wanted to see how far the assumption went. I wanted to know whether my explicit consent had ever actually mattered, or whether the system ran entirely on inference. What I learned was sobering. There were moments when a simple check-in would have changed everything. Are you okay with this? How do you feel about that? Those questions never came. Silence in this context wasn't misunderstood. It was utilized, and yet the longer I observed, the less emotional weight it carried. I wasn't stewing, I wasn't building resentment, I was gaining clarity. Each interaction added another data point, another confirmation that the issue wasn't behavior in isolation. It was the underlying contract. I realized that confronting too early would only trigger defense. It would turn into reassurance, denial, and reframing. The familiar cycle. I didn't want reassurance, I wanted the truth. So I let them speak freely. Let assumptions surface unchallenged. Let the narrative fully articulate itself without interruption. It's remarkable how much people reveal when they believe they're safe from consequence. During this time, my inner world grew steadier. I felt less reactive, more grounded, not detached, but anchored. I knew something I hadn't known before, and that knowledge gave me patience. I wasn't pretending anymore. I was listening. What others interpreted as passivity was actually restraint. I understood that if I spoke now, it would be to change something, and I wasn't ready to do that until I understood what exactly needed to change or end. Silence, once chosen, becomes powerful, not because it intimidates, but because it removes noise. It lets reality speak in its own voice. And reality, when given enough room, rarely lies. What they never noticed was how much I was learning, not because I suddenly became suspicious or cold, but because I stopped filling in the blanks for them. I let conversations end where they naturally ended. I let explanations remain vague. I let inconsistencies sit without being smoothed over by my understanding. And in that space, information accumulated. I began paying attention to timing, not in a paranoid way, but in a practical one. Who texted late? Which nights ran long? How certain names appeared only in passing, never with detail. I noticed how stories were told differently depending on the audience. How context shifted slightly, just enough to maintain plausibility. None of this required confrontation, it required presence. I started documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. Dates, phrases, patterns. I didn't label anything as betrayal or innocence. I labeled it as data. The way I would work is when trying to understand a system that wasn't behaving as expected. What struck me was how little effort was made to conceal anything. There were no locked phones, no elaborate lies, just assumptions. Assumptions that I wasn't paying attention, that I wouldn't connect dots, even if they were placed gently in front of me. That underestimation worked in my favor. I also began educating myself quietly about finances, about legal structures, about what partnership actually meant beyond sentiment. I reviewed documents we both had access to, but only I ever read closely. I learned where things were held, how decisions were made, and what options existed that I'd never considered necessary to know before. None of this changed my outward behavior. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't interrogate. I didn't signal the alarm. And because nothing appeared different, no one adjusted their behavior in response. That's the advantage of being underestimated. You're not seen as a variable. I noticed, too, how often my spouse spoke about loyalty in abstract terms, how commitment was framed as emotional rather than behavioral, how faithfulness was discussed as intention, not action. These weren't slips. They were philosophical positions. And slowly the picture clarified. Monogamy, as I understood it, had never been explicitly agreed upon in their mind. It was assumed to be flexible, contextual, and open to interpretation. The fidelity I believed we shared was something I had been practicing alone. That realization didn't shock me. It settled. I understood then why my boundaries had felt invisible, because they had never been acknowledged as binding. They were seen as personal preferences, not shared commitments. What they never noticed was that once I understood this, my loyalty shifted. Not away from the relationship immediately, but toward myself, toward clarity, toward truth. I stopped protecting their image in my mind. I stopped translating their behavior into something more palatable. I let it be what it was, and what it was consistent. I also noticed how much emotional labor I had been doing without recognition, how often I had managed discomfort quietly so others wouldn't have to. Once I stopped doing that, things didn't fall apart. They simply revealed their natural state. There was no villainy here, just misaligned values obscured by my willingness to accommodate. The final thing they never noticed was how calm I became. Not numb. Calm. The kind of calm that comes when uncertainty ends. When you're no longer trying to reconcile incompatible realities. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I wasn't even preparing to leave yet. I was preparing to act with full information. And information, once gathered without distortion, has weight. I carried that weight carefully. I didn't announce it. I didn't share it. I simply held it, knowing that when the time came, I would move from understanding to decision. Quietly, precisely. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no surge of emotion, no dramatic moment where everything suddenly clicked into place. It arrived quietly, almost politely, as if it had been waiting for me to be ready. I was sitting alone when it happened, not searching for anything in particular, just reviewing what I already knew. By then, I had enough pieces laid out that I could stop pretending they were unrelated. The patterns weren't ambiguous anymore. They were consistent, repeatable, and most importantly, coherent. They told a single story, and that story was this. My spouse had never believed fidelity was a shared obligation. It was something they offered conditionally, situationally, and always on their own terms. What made this realization different from suspicion was its completeness. There were no gaps left to fill with hope. No need to assume hidden good intentions. The behavior aligned perfectly with the philosophy they'd been expressing all along, just never directly to me. I understood then why my questions had always been met with reassurance instead of clarity. Why have boundaries been treated as flexible suggestions? Why was my silence so comfortable for them? Because from their perspective, there was nothing to confess. They weren't breaking a rule. They were operating within one I hadn't known existed. That was the hardest part. Not the infidelity itself, but the asymmetry of understanding. I had been faithful to an agreement that lived only in my mind. They had been faithful to their own interpretation, one they never felt obligated to disclose fully. The phrase that surfaced, uninvited but accurate, was simple. Monogamy was never part of the agreement, only I didn't know. Sitting with that truth was strangely stabilizing. It removed the last traces of self-doubt. I wasn't naive. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't asking for too much. I had been playing by the rules I thought were shared. There was grief, yes, but it was clean grief, not chaotic or overwhelming. It didn't knock the air out of me. It settled into my chest like a weight I could carry. I didn't cry right away. I didn't need to. Tears felt premature, as if they belonged to a later stage. Right then, what I felt most was clarity. I thought about all the times I'd been described as understanding. How often that word had been used to justify excluding me from full transparency. Understanding, in that context, had meant not asking questions that would complicate things. I saw now how my character had been used to stabilize a dynamic that benefited someone else. The reveal wasn't about catching them in a lie. It was about recognizing a misalignment so fundamental that no amount of communication could have bridged it. Because one side hadn't believed disclosure was necessary. I didn't confront them. Not because I was afraid, but because confrontation would have turned this into a debate about definitions, about intentions, about how things were meant. I wasn't interested in that. I didn't need an admission. I didn't need validation. I had already verified reality for myself. What surprised me was how little anger I felt. There was disappointment, yes, a sense of loss, not just of trust, but of time, of emotional investment in a version of the relationship that had never existed reciprocally. But anger requires surprise, and by then, I was no longer surprised. The reveal marked the end of uncertainty. It was the moment when observation turned into knowing, and knowing, once it arrives, is irreversible. I understood that whatever came next had to be intentional, not reactive, not performative. I owed myself that much. So I closed my notebook, I made tea. I sat in the quiet of the room and let the truth settle fully into place. I didn't rush to act. I just accepted that the life I thought I was living had already ended, long before I realized it. Once the truth settled, the noise stopped. That's the best way I can describe it. The constant low-level questioning, the mental negotiations, the quiet self-corrections, all of it went silent. Not because I had answers to everything, but because I no longer needed them. I stood at a decision point I hadn't rushed toward, but had arrived at naturally. There were options. I saw them clearly. I could confront my spouse immediately, lay out what I knew, and force a conversation that would likely spiral into semantics and defensiveness. I could demand new rules, explicit agreements, and retroactive honesty. I could try to rebuild something on clearer terms. I could also leave abruptly. Name the betrayal, pack a bag, draw a sharp line, and walk away with my dignity intact but my life abruptly fractured. Both options were valid. Both would have been understandable, but neither felt aligned with who I was or what I needed next. Because this wasn't just about fidelity, it was about consent. About the fact that my participation in the relationship had been based on incomplete information. And consent, once violated at that level, can't simply be renegotiated under pressure. I understood that if I confronted too soon, I would be pulled back into the familiar role, the reasonable one, the understanding one, the one who absorbs complexity so others don't have to. I would end up managing their emotions, clarifying their intentions, softening my own clarity to keep the conversation civil, and I was done doing that. What I needed wasn't an explanation, it was autonomy. So I chose the third option, the one that didn't announce itself. I chose to decide privately. That decision was simple, even if its implications were not. I would no longer organize my life around a relationship that had never been fully honest with me. I didn't need to label the relationship yet. I didn't need to declare an ending. I just needed to stop treating it as the center of my future planning. That shift changed everything. Once I made that choice internally, my fear evaporated. There was nothing left to protect. No illusion. I was afraid of losing. The worst thing had already happened, not the infidelity, but the realization that my understanding had been unilateral. From that point on, every action became deliberate. I began separating emotionally first. Not coldly, not cruelly, just realistically. I stopped projecting a shared future. I stopped making sacrifices that assumed permanence. I stopped explaining myself. This wasn't punishment, it was alignment. I also gave myself time. Time to grieve quietly. Time to think clearly. Time to prepare for a transition that would affect not just me, but the structure of my life. I didn't tell anyone, not friends, not family, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted my decisions to be clean, untainted by other people's reactions or advice. This had to come from me. The most surprising part was how steady I felt. There was sadness, yes, but it was contained, manageable. It didn't destabilize me, because the decision wasn't emotional. It was ethical. I could not continue participating in something that required me to remain uninformed in order to function. That wasn't a partnership. It was convenience disguised as trust. So I chose the irreversible path, not in action yet, but in direction. Once you stop planning a future with someone, everything else becomes logistics. And logistics, unlike emotions, can be handled calmly. Once the decision was made internally, my life entered a strange, quiet phase. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still came home at the same time. We still shared meals, routines, and familiar rhythms. I laughed at the right moments. I listened. I participated. The structure of the relationship remained intact. But internally, I was no longer living inside it. I began moving in silence. Not because I wanted secrecy, but because clarity doesn't require announcement. I had learned that loud decisions invite interference. Quiet ones complete themselves. The first thing I did was slow down. I stopped rushing through days. I paid attention to details I'd previously ignored. Where were kept, how finances were organized, which accounts were joint, which were not. None of this was hidden from me. I had simply never needed to look closely before. I reviewed everything calmly, methodically, not with suspicion, but with responsibility. This was my life. I was allowed to understand how it functioned. I opened a separate account in my own name, not to take anything, not to punish, but to ensure autonomy. I redirected my income. I adjusted automatic payments. Small changes invisible unless you knew where to look. I consulted professionals quietly, not to escalate, but to educate myself. I asked neutral questions. I learned what my options were, what timelines looked like, and what choices preserve stability rather than chaos. No one panicked, no alarms went off. That's the thing about systems built on assumptions. They don't notice when one part quietly disengages, at least not at first. I also began recentering my life outside the marriage. Not dramatically. I didn't announce new independence. I simply reclaimed parts of myself I'd set aside. I spent more time alone, more time reading, more time thinking about what I wanted my days to feel like when no one else's preferences were involved. Emotionally, I became lighter, not because I was numb, but because I wasn't carrying uncertainty anymore. I knew where I stood. I knew where this was going, even if the final steps hadn't been taken yet. My spouse didn't notice the shift. Or if they did, they interpreted it as calm contentment, the same misreading that had always worked in their favor. I stopped offering reassurance. I stopped smoothing over awkwardness. I didn't create conflict, but I also didn't resolve it for them. If something felt unclear, I let it remain so. That too went unnoticed. I realized then how much labor I'd been doing to maintain emotional equilibrium. Once I stopped, the imbalance didn't explode. It simply became visible. Still, I didn't confront. I wasn't avoiding the truth. I was allowing it to complete its arc. There's a difference between silence that hides and silence that prepares. Mine was the latter. I understood that when the time came, I wanted to speak from a place of stability, not reaction. I wanted my words to be factual, not fueled, and that required patience. Moving in silence meant choosing timing over impulse, precision over performance. I wasn't waiting for permission, I was waiting for readiness. And with each quiet adjustment, I felt myself stepping further into alignment. Not against anyone else, but toward myself. The ground beneath me was solid again. I knew what I was doing. I knew why. And soon, others would feel the shift, without yet understanding its source. The first consequences didn't arrive as accusations or confrontations. They arrived in confusion. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss. My spouse began to sense something was different. Not wrong exactly, just unfamiliar. The usual emotional cushioning wasn't there. The automatic reassurance they had come to expect no longer arrived on schedule. They would mention plans casually, the way they always had, and wait for my response. I still nodded, still listened. But I no longer filled in the emotional blanks. I didn't ask questions designed to make things easier. I didn't offer validation where none was requested explicitly, and that absence was registered, not consciously, not yet. But the rhythm was off. I noticed small hesitations in their voice, moments where they seemed to wait for something, approval perhaps, or at least acknowledgement, and didn't quite receive it. They would glance at me, then continue talking, slightly less certain than before. It was the first time I saw what my silence had previously been doing. Without it, they had to sit with their own assumptions. Friends, too, began reacting differently. Invitations came with more explanation than before. "We're all meeting up, if you're okay with that," someone said once, as if testing unfamiliar ground. I smiled and said, "Do what works for you." It wasn't dismissive, it was neutral. That neutrality made people uncomfortable, not because it was cold, but because it removed a familiar emotional anchor. I had been the person who smoothed transitions, who reassured everyone that everything was fine. Without that role being performed, the system felt unstable. Still, no one could point to anything concrete. Nothing had happened. No argument, no announcement, just a quiet shift in how much emotional labor I was willing to provide. At home, the air changed slowly. Conversations ended sooner. There were pauses that hadn't existed before. My spouse seemed more restless, more alert, as if listening for something they couldn't quite identify. One evening they asked, "Are you okay?" It was the first time the question had been asked without an obvious prompt. I looked at them and answered honestly, "Yes." They seemed relieved and unsettled, because the question hadn't really been about my well-being. It had been about whether the familiar dynamic was still intact, and my answer didn't restore it. Over the following weeks, the consequences accumulated quietly. Decisions that had once been effortless now required negotiation. Not because I argued, but because I no longer pre-agreed. My spouse began explaining themselves more. Not confessing, explaining. Filling space with justifications I hadn't asked for. Their confidence wavered, replaced by something like uncertainty. I watched without satisfaction or cruelty. This wasn't vindication. It was confirmation. When a dynamic depends on one person's silence, removing that silence, even gently, changes everything. The most striking part was how quickly the imbalance became visible once I stopped compensating for it. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No boundary had been enforced yet, and still the structure was shifting. I realized then that my earlier fear that speaking up would create chaos had been misplaced. Chaos hadn't come from honesty. It had come from reliance on unspoken labor. As that labor quietly withdrew, others had to adjust. Some did. Some didn't know how. And my spouse, for the first time, began to sense loss. Not of me exactly, but of the certainty that had surrounded them. The certainty that I would always be there, absorbing ambiguity without question. They didn't yet understand what was happening, but they felt it, and once felt, it couldn't be unfelt. By the time they realized something was wrong, they were already behind it, not because I had moved quickly, but because clarity travels faster than denial. Once I had stepped out of the role that kept everything balanced, there was no way to restore it without acknowledging why it existed in the first place. My spouse began trying to fix things, though they never named what they were fixing. There were gestures, small ones at first, extra check-ins, casual offers of reassurance I hadn't asked for. "You know you're my priority," they'd say, out of nowhere. Or, "We're solid, we always have been." The words were familiar, the timing was not. What they didn't do was ask what had changed. Not directly. That would have required opening a door they weren't ready to walk through. Instead, they circled the issue, hoping proximity would restore normalcy. It didn't. I listened. I acknowledged. I didn't argue. And because I wasn't pushing back, it took them longer to realize that reassurance only works when uncertainty still exists. Mine was gone. There came a point when the panic broke through the calm. It showed in the way questions were asked too quickly, and answers were offered too defensively. In the way they monitored my reactions more closely than before. In the sudden desire to define us, to anchor the relationship with language that had been avoided for years. "We should talk about boundaries," they said one evening, as if the idea had just occurred to them. I nodded. "We can." But the conversation never quite materialized, because boundaries discussed under threat aren't the same as boundaries honored from the beginning. And we both knew, without saying it, that this wasn't about defining values. It was about preventing loss. They wanted reassurance that the system still worked. I wanted to understand why it had required my silence to function at all. The gap between those goals was unbridgeable. What struck me most was how quickly revisionist narratives appeared. The past was reframed. Certain actions were minimized. Intentions were emphasized over impact. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought we were on the same page." "You could have said something sooner." Each sentence shifted responsibility subtly, away from omission, toward miscommunication, toward my failure to object loudly enough. I didn't correct them, not because they were entirely wrong, but because the conversation they were trying to have belonged to an earlier version of me. That version needed understanding, needed acknowledgement, needed repair. This version didn't. It wasn't that I was unwilling to talk. It was that the outcome they wanted, a return to assumed alignment, was no longer possible. The moment for that had passed quietly, months ago when I stopped believing in it. Their regret was real. I could see that. The confusion, too. They genuinely hadn't expected consequences, not because they were cruel, but because the system had insulated them from them for so long. They had believed my silence was comfort, not consent. By the time they realized otherwise, the silence had already done its work. There was a moment, brief, unspoken, when I could see them recalculating, trying to determine how much honesty would be enough, how much change might be required, whether the effort could still tip the scales. But you can't retrofit integrity. You can't disclose values only once they're threatened. And you can't ask someone to stay in a structure that requires them to be uninformed in order to feel secure. That was the point of no return. Not dramatic, not declared, just quietly understood. They were trying to fix something that no longer existed, and I was no longer the person who could help them do it. When the confrontation finally happened, it was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no dramatic reveal, no rehearsed speeches or emotional ultimatums. Just two people sitting across from each other, in a room that felt suddenly smaller because there was nothing left to avoid. My spouse initiated it, not with an accusation, but with a question that carried more fear than curiosity. "Are you thinking about leaving?" I took a moment before answering, not to calculate, but to choose precision. "Yes," I said. The word landed quietly between us. It wasn't thrown, it wasn't emphasized, it was simply placed there. They stared at me, searching my face for something, anger perhaps, or doubt. There was neither. "Why?" they asked. "When did this happen?" I didn't start with events. I didn't list examples. I didn't build a case. "I realized we weren't in the same agreement," I said, "and we never had been." They tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand gently, not to silence them, just to finish my thought. "I don't believe you intended to stay faithful in the way I understood faithfulness," I continued. "And I don't think you ever felt obligated to explain that difference to me." There it was, clean, unembellished. They protested, of course, not angrily, confused, defensive, hurt. "That's not fair. I never cheated on you. I thought we trusted each other." I listened, fully, without preparing a rebuttal. When they finished, I nodded. "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. "I believe you were operating within your own understanding. That's the problem." The room went quiet again. I explained then, not emotionally but carefully, what I had observed. How assumptions had replaced conversations. How my silence had been interpreted as consent. How boundaries had been inferred rather than respected. I didn't accuse. I described. At one point they said, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I answered honestly, "I did, in small ways." And when it didn't lead to clarity, I stopped. That's when I started listening instead. That landed harder than any accusation could have. There were tears. Theirs, not mine. Not because I was cold, but because I had already done my grieving privately. This conversation wasn't the beginning of my pain. It was the conclusion of it. They asked if there was anything they could do now. Change. Be more transparent. Recommit. I considered the question carefully. "If we were having this conversation before I had to find out on my own," I said, "maybe. But I can't unlearn what I know." They reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. I also didn't squeeze back. "This isn't punishment," I added. "It's alignment. I need to live inside the truth, not negotiate it." There was no dramatic ending to the conversation, no slamming doors, just the quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had ended, not in anger, but in clarity. We discussed logistics briefly. Practical things, how to handle the transition with dignity. When it was over, I stood up, feeling strangely light. Confrontation, I learned, doesn't have to be explosive to be final. Sometimes the calmest conversation is the one that changes everything. After the confrontation, life didn't rush to fill the space that opened up. There was no immediate relief, no dramatic sense of freedom. What there was instead was quiet, deep, neutral quiet, the kind that doesn't demand interpretation. I moved into that quite slowly. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how often I checked myself for guilt, as if expecting it to arrive late. It didn't. Sadness came in waves, yes. Grief, too. But guilt never did. That's how I knew the decision had been aligned. I hadn't left out of anger. I hadn't left to prove a point. I had left because continuing would have required me to compromise something essential, my right to informed consent, to clarity, to truth. Who I am now is not hardened. That's a common assumption. That clarity turns people sharp or closed. It didn't do that to me. What it did was make me precise. I no longer confuse calm with compatibility. I no longer assume shared values without explicit conversation. I don't mistake flexibility for virtue when it only flows one way. I still value loyalty, deeply. But now I understand that loyalty without transparency isn't noble. It's dangerous. It asks one person to carry risk, while the other carries freedom. I'm no longer interested in being easy. That doesn't mean I'm difficult. It means I don't disappear to make relationships smoother. I don't absorb discomfort to preserve appearances. I let questions exist. I let silence speak when it needs to. People respond to me differently now, some with more respect, some with unease. I'm okay with both. I've noticed that those who benefited from my quiet flexibility miss the old version of me. Those who value mutuality don't. I take that as information. My life is simpler now, not smaller, simpler. I make decisions without translating them for someone else's comfort. I trust my perceptions without immediately interrogating them. I no longer need to prove that something is wrong before honoring that it doesn't feel right. And perhaps most importantly, I understand that being underestimated was never my weakness. It was my camouflage. I learned patience there, observation, discernment. I learned how systems function when one person does all the stabilizing. And I learned exactly what happens when that person stops. There's no bitterness in that knowledge, just clarity. If I love again, and I may, it will be with eyes open, values spoken, agreements made visible. Not because I'm afraid of betrayal, but because I respect myself too much to participate in ambiguity that only benefits someone else. I don't regret the years I spent believing in the relationship. Belief wasn't foolish. It was sincere. The mistake wasn't trust. It was trusting without verification when verification was consistently avoided. Now, I don't need to harden myself against the world. I simply stand in it differently, quietly, fully, on my own terms. There's a temptation, when a relationship ends like this, to look for a villain, to assign moral weight in a way that makes the story easier to digest. I understand that impulse. Clear villains offer clean closure, but real life rarely works that way. What happened to me wasn't the result of cruelty. It was the result of omission, of values assumed rather than shared, of silence being treated as consent because it was more convenient than conversation. The lesson I carry forward isn't never trust. It's never participate in an agreement you haven't been fully informed about. Love does not excuse secrecy. Calm does not equal consent. And being understanding should never require you to misunderstand yourself. If there's a moral here, it's this. Clarity is not unromantic. It's respectful. The people who resist defining the terms of a relationship are often the ones who benefit most from keeping them vague. And silence, especially from those who are patient, loyal, and accommodating, can be dangerously easy to misinterpret. Not because it means approval, but because others are comfortable believing it does. I don't regret being kind. I don't regret being flexible. But I do regret the time I spent translating someone else's values into something I could live with, instead of asking whether I should have been living with them at all. This story isn't a warning against love. It's a reminder that love without mutual understanding is not intimacy, it's proximity. If you recognize yourself anywhere in this, know this. You are not wrong for wanting clarity. You are not demanding by asking questions. And you are not dramatic for needing your consent to be informed and ongoing. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't confront or expose or demand answers. It's to stop agreeing silently. And if you're watching this wondering whether something in your own life feels slightly misaligned, something you've been minimizing or explaining away, pay attention to that quiet signal. It's rarely loud at first, but it's usually accurate. I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, slowly and quietly, that you were being loyal to an agreement you never actually made?